Do some of these countries have, a head start or an advantage on, say, the US, in that, there it's baked in, it's customary to have two, three generations living under one roof. Here, right, we're hyper independent, and when we have to take on mom and dad, it's or the grandkids, it's a different, it's not quite the same.
Yeah, sure. So yes and no. The answer, Karen, is yes, you're right, and no, you're wrong. So I'll tell you, yes, of course. I mean, we do have this, let's call it I'm trying to think of another word of than cult, but let's call it that, a cult of youth and independence. We value those as a society. We elevate those ideas up, and that does drive a certain ageist view of the value of the second half of life, but also tends to push kids out from the home earlier than
right.
Other countries and other societies. That's the yes part, and that's something that makes it harder for us in the U.S. to think of multi-generational relationships as a foundational part of a public health strategy, for instance, or a connection strategy. No, because that's a recent invention. It wasn't until the beginning of the 20th century, relatively recently in the arc of time, that people in the U.S. Didn't live in multi-generational households. That was a foundation of an agrarian society, which we were, right? People generally speaking, lived on farms or something like farms, and lived in multi-generational and worked together in multi-generational collaborations. That was until relatively recently, that's the way everyone lived and thought of as a natural course of life. It was only in the 20th century with the urbanization of the U.S. and I think sort of elevation of this idea of youth and mobility that people began to think of that as the natural way. And, when they think of it as a natural way, they also think of that's the right way. Mm. Even though for all of history, that's not how Americans and humans have lived. There's also, I would say, even the U.S., there's not an inevitability to that idea. The rise of multi-generational living has actually been increasing in the U.S. for the last 15 years. Got a big boost during COVID, but it was actually on the rise beforehand, and it's also continued to increase since COVID, probably mostly because of economics.
Yes.
But economics drives a lot of what eventually turns into sort of cultural norms.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of interesting factors at play. What about cultural differences in these countries with how they view retirement and work?
Yeah. So let's talk about Japan, for instance, which I think in some ways is the most fascinating case study of all. So Japan, the longest lived country on earth, if you don't count Monaco, which I do not. Median life expectancy for women in Japan is now 90. Wow. And this is sort of pause on that. Like half the women in Japan live past 90, half don't. So if someone dies at 89, you say bad luck. Wow. That's really, that's where they've gotten. It's an extraordinary thing. And that has driven a lot of changes in how they think around cultural norms. And in Japan, I wrote lots of different things, but I wrote mostly about work because it's not only the oldest country on the earth, 30% of people are over the age of 65, a higher percentage of people over the 65 work than anywhere else. And that's largely not because of economics, but because because during this century, the culture has come to the conclusion, has reached a cultural consensus that work over past 65 is really good for social connection and purpose. Mm. And it's now considered an agreed upon notion that working is good for you under certain conditions. And it's really important to your health and well-being. It wasn't all the ways actually Japan until relatively recently, until the end of the last century, had this sort of forced retirement at the age of 60 or 65. They basically kicked people out. Now that has all changed. And in fact, there's sort of a second work economy that's created that is built around the needs of older workers. And that's almost exclusively part-time work with job sharing and a lot of use of assistive technology. So there's there's an organization called Silver Genzai Human Resources Organization, which represents 1 million Japanese between the age of 65 and I think about 101 who are still working, but they only place people in part-time work because that's the idea is like after 65, I'm going to transition away from this actually kind of brutal work economy that Japan has to one that is really built around my needs. And the culture has changed. The work economy has changed to accommodate that because they actually need older workers. And that's just a signature of the Japanese approach to the second half of life that's very different than actually most other countries.